This video is about race and economic outcomes, part 2. Is there evidence that people of color as a group do worse than whites? If so, what is it? What structures prevent equal opportunity for people of color? And then what solutions and policy are out there? This last one will be in part 3. So let's dig into the data. First of all, who's in the top 10% of all incomes in the U.S.? We'll start with whites. They're at the top here. And they are also in the top 10%. But they have lost ground, right? So in 2000, they were more represented in the top 10% than they were in the year 2014. So this line demarking 1 here is, if you're to the right of that, you're more represented in that highest decile of income than your ethnicity is represented in the total population. So whites are more likely to be in the top 10% than they are likely to be in the total population. They're overrepresented, we would say. And so are Asians. Asians have made quite substantial increases in their representation in the top 10%. So while whites have lost a little bit of ground but are still overrepresented, Asians were overrepresented and now are even more overrepresented in the crazy rich category, if you will. And most other groups have gained, but they are still underrepresented in the top 10%. And what about the other end of the spectrum, the bottom 10%? In those 14 years, it looks as if whites are less likely to be in the bottom 10% than they were. Other groups and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders and Hispanic, Black are more likely to be in the bottom 10%. They're overrepresented in the bottom 10%. Okay, let's talk employment. Because most Americans earn most of their income from wages, employment obviously matters massively for explaining inequality. So what are we seeing? We're seeing on the left, men. Let's change our pointer here. Men are broken into white in the blue line, Hispanic in the red line, Asian, which we don't have as much data for, in the green line, and then black on the black line here. And so you can see that the employment rates for men tend to stick together unless you're black. They all reduce employment or increase unemployment during these vertical gray bars, which are recessions. And so men lose a lot of ground during recessions. A lot of recessions have a lot of manufacturing decline, blue-collar work is declined. Men are more likely to be in those kind of jobs. And it picks back up afterwards. But notice how much higher the employment rates for all men besides black men are. Now, when you look over at women, that's not the same. So women typically are working less. There's less women in the workforce. The employment rates are higher. And the main takeaways here are that Hispanic women are much less represented in the labor force than everybody else. Women also lose ground in recessions, but not as much as men. And then also notably, black women lost ground in the last recession prior to this one, but are making up ground and have surpassed white women in terms of embodiment in the labor force. How about poverty rates? Well, those also have a racial component, unfortunately. So you're looking at black poverty rates here. Those are higher traditionally. White poverty rates are at the lowest. Also, Asian poverty rates are pretty low as well. So generally, you can see sort of the trend over time. Poverty isn't getting much different or better. And we're seeing that there are some racial components, and they last. They're persistent over decades. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in this one. The important takeaways are, what does poverty look like by race and region? So, in the West, poverty rates for whites are much lower overall than Native Americans, but that depends if you're suburban, urban, or rural. So you can see and you can take some time on this graph if you want, but the main takeaways are basically that when you're living in the South, it looks like rural for all ethnicities is problematic and gives you higher poverty. If you're in the Northeast, urban, at least for Native American and Hispanic and Asian people, is more likely to get you into poverty. So there's a lot of different aspects to poverty that matter, but certainly if you look at the ratios of just race alone, whites tend to be on the low end of poverty, Native Americans tend to be on the high end of poverty, and so do blacks. And then that is across the U.S., across West, South, Midwest, and Northeast. Now, something that's really important to income inequality is wealth inequality. And what's the mechanism that wealth turns into income inequality? Well, we know there's stuff like more wealth being correlated with more education, more risk-taking. You can take more risks, become an entrepreneur when you've got wealth under your belt. Better schools. Typically wealthier people live in better school districts and can afford more expensive schools when they go on to university. You have access to more networks of wealthy people, which are how a lot of people get jobs. There's some data about the Ivy Leagues. The majority of people in Ivy Leagues are either athletic recruits or are legacy, their parents have gone there, or are major donors. So these networks are very important to our highest earning Americans, our elites, if you will. And obviously there's more enrichment activities, study abroad, things that really do add to our potential, add to our human capital, and add to our hireability. And as you might have guessed, there is a racial component to wealth. So whites are much more likely to have home ownership rates than blacks or Hispanics. And home ownership turns out to be one of the most important, if not the most important, sources of wealth for Americans. And here's another pretty dense set of data. But if you're looking at renting households, here over on the left, you're looking at housing cost burden by race. So racial components, white people, if they're renting, close to 60% of whites spend less than 30% of their income on housing costs, whereas only 15 to 17% of whites spend more than 50%. So if you look at the racial components here, fewer blacks are likely to spend that low of an amount on their housing, right? And if you look at what we would call burdened households over here, spending over half of their money on housing, it's more likely to be Hispanic than black or white. And over here with owner-occupied households, we already know that whites are more likely to be homeowners. Even among homeowner households, if you're white, it gives you the correlation that you're less likely to spend as much of your income on your housing as other races. What about educational outcomes? So you're looking at the white-black gap. So whites are doing better than blacks in math, 4th grade, 8th grade. Some good news for reading is that gap seems to be closing. But in 8th grade, you can see the gap has reappeared. And you know from the movie 13th, the U.S. wins the incarceration fight over and above everybody else. And this is fairly recent. So the green data are 1983, and we did have more incarceration, more of our people behind bars in 1983 than other countries. But that really took off between 83 and 2001. So it's almost like you need to draw a new graph to fit the U.S.'s data in. And there's racial components, as you know. Some really interesting data is in health. So let's look at this health data. Probability of having a stroke, heart attack, or heart disease, is there a racial component? Well, let's look first at the horizontal axis. You're looking at age. So for all this data, the older you get, the more likely you are to suffer one of those maladies. But if you're black, it's a higher rate of morbidity. Basically, you're at much higher risk for these sort of maladies. But what's interesting is that you notice this is black, no controls. Black, after family and neighborhood controls, those data are just the same as whites. What does it mean to control for neighborhood controls and family controls? That means if you take just the black men who live in the same neighborhoods, who have the same family characteristics, basically income is the same, education is the same, basically everything except skin color is the same as whites, it reduces their morbidity. And an interesting corollary is that recent data has come out about black women. They're 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than white women. That's an astonishing number. And same thing, they took some controls and they found out that black women in the same income categories, educational categories as white women still suffered higher death rates when having babies. And so this is a really nice, big, open question. I mean nice in terms of complex and important. So stress, treatment by doctors, all sorts of things are possible culprits for this, but it's an open question. Okay, so what does this all have to do with outcomes? Well, as you might imagine, there's earnings gap, right? So with more access to wealth, with more access to longevity, etc., white people are out earning people of color, with the exception of Asian Americans. So we've got, for men over here on the left, you've got sort of they're the default here. They're taken as the sort of default income, and then they compare everybody else to that income. Asian people have gained income and are now, Asian men rather, are now on par and probably increased above white men. But the others, the story is not as happy. For blacks, Hispanics, American Indian, Alaskan Natives, you get sort of a decline compared to white men's wages. For women, white women are set as the default here, and Asian women have always out-earned, in all the data anyway, out-earned white women, and that they've rebounded. And black women, for a little bit, out-earned white women, but that's now on the decline, as well as the other ethnicities here. All right, how about wealth by race? Well, white families do have a hell of a lot more wealth than black and Hispanic families, and that matters. It matters quite a bit. How about the gap over time? That gap in wealth, the general trend line between white and black families is rising. So the bad news just keeps coming. What about income mobility? Many of us would say, all right, we can tolerate some inequality if there's adequate mobility. That Karl Marx even said that of the American experiment. The American economy early on was indeed very open to upward mobility by many people. It was not the typical class-based society that you saw in old Europe. So the bad news, though, is that you're more likely to be upwardly mobile if you're white than if you're black, from the bottom at least. And that's also true from the bottom 50%, not just the poorest 20%. So that's upward mobility is higher for whites than for blacks, and downward mobility is more likely for blacks than for whites, although it's not as stark a contrast. But from the wealthiest half, rather than the wealthiest 20%, it's much more likely that you'll fall out of the top 50% if you're black than if you're white. But to end on a somewhat positive note here, the upward mobility for blacks born more recently has been increasing. So if this trend holds over time, the upward mobility gap between whites and blacks may be gone. If we were in class together, we'd get in groups and talk about this and discuss. But perhaps at home, you want to think about this on your own or talk to a sibling or a friend or a parent. What are some of the benefits of increased economic equality between ethnicities? And what are some of the costs?